Pretty Selma, A Little Red Riding Hood Story from Africa by Nikki Daly. Selma lived with her granny and grandfather on the quiet side of town. One day, her granny said, "Selma, pretty Selma, please go to market for your old granny who loves you so." Selma put on her blue scarf, her stripy intama, her pretty white beads, and her yellow sandals. She tucked Granny's shopping list into her intama, lifted Granny's big straw basket onto her head, and kissed Granny goodbye. "Straight there and back again," said Granny, "and don't talk to strangers, you hear?" "Okay, I promise," said Selma. Off went Selma, flip-flop in her yellow sandals. As she walked, she sang her favorite song. "Oh, Selma, pretty Selma, come kiss Granny, your darling old Granny who loves you so." At the market, she bought a giant watermelon, a speckled rooster, an ice-cold pink drink, and a bunch of candy-striped straws. The sun was growing hot and the basket felt heavy, so Selma decided to take a shortcut home through the wild side of town. Along the way, she sang her favorite song. "Oh, Selma, pretty Selma, come kiss Granny, your darling old Granny who loves you so." "Are you pretty Selma?" asked a stranger. It was Mr. Dog. He had been listening to her song. "Yes," said Selma. "Are you going to Granny's?" asked Mr. Dog. "Yes," said Selma. "Well, your basket is much too heavy for such a pretty little head," said Mr. Dog. "Allow me to carry it for you." Selma did feel a bit dizzy from the heat, so she agreed to let Mr. Dog carry her basket. So already, are you guys noticing how some of our key details are the same and some of our key details are different? So the first thing I'm noticing is the who in our story. I'm noticing that there's a Selma instead of Red Riding Hood. I'm noticing that there's a granny in both stories. But I'm noticing that in our original version of the Little Red Riding Hood story, there's a big bad wolf, and in this version, there's a Mr. Dog. So I think that's a really important difference. So if I take a look at my Venn diagram, over here underneath Red Riding Hood, I'm going to write that there's a wolf, and over here, under Pretty Selma, I'm going to write Mr. Dog, because that's his name. So those are things that are different about these two stories. But the part that I noticed that was the same is that they both have a granny. Okay, so there's a granny in both stories. And then the second key detail that I noticed was different was the where. At the beginning of this story, Pretty Selma is at her house where she lives with Granny. In the Red Riding Hood story we listened to earlier this week, Little Red Riding Hood lived with her mom and was going to visit her granny. So how could I write that down? Underneath the Red Riding Hood version, I am going to write that she lives with Granny. And underneath Pretty Selma, I'm going to write goes, nope, I had that backwards. Underneath Red Riding Hood, I'm going to write visits Granny. And underneath Pretty Selma, I'm going to write lives with Granny, because that seems like an important difference. So let's see if I got that right, since I was a little confused. So in the Red Riding Hood story we listened to earlier this week, she's going to visit Granny. And in this version of Pretty Selma, she lives with Granny. And then that setting also is different because in the Red Riding Hood stories we've listened to so far, Little Red Riding Hood is walking through the woods. But in this version of the story, she's walking through town. So underneath Red Riding Hood, I'm going to write woods. And underneath Pretty Selma, I'm going to write town. Those seem like important differences. And then the last thing that I noticed is in terms of what happens, right? Because our key details are who, where, and what happens. In both versions of the story, an adult tells the girl not to talk to strangers but she does it anyway. That seems like a really important thing that is the same that makes these two stories similar. So in the middle, that's where I'm going to write adult warns not to talk to strangers, because that seems like what's the same. Okay, so given that she's just started talking to Mr. Dog, and we kind of are guessing that Mr. Dog is this trickster character who's listening to her song, he's being very tricky, I'm wondering what's going to happen next. After a while, Mr. Dog asked, "What are you wearing on your feet?" "Sandals," replied pretty Salma. "They must be making your feet very hot," he said. "Why don't I wear them for you?" So they stopped, and Mr. Dog slipped his big feet into Salma's sandals. On they went, flippity-flop, flippity-flop. After a while, Mr. Dog asked, "What's that wrap you're wearing?" "Mine Tama," replied Salma. "I bet you'd feel cooler without it. I'd be happy to wear it for you." No sooner had Mr. Dog wrapped Salma's and Tama around himself than he asked for her scarf and pretty beads. "How do I look?" asked Mr. Dog, striking a pose. Mr. Dog strutted along the road in high style. Salma began to miss her things, but when she asked for them back, Mr. Dog only said, "Some music will help us beat the heat. Won't you teach me a song?" So Salma tried to teach him her favorite song. "Oh, Salma, pretty Salma, come kiss Granny, your darling old Granny, who loves you so." But Mr. Dog was hopeless at singing. All he could do was go, "Woof, woof, woof." "I need a lot more practice," said Mr. Dog, "and until I learn to sing, you won't get your things back." Salma begged. Salma pleaded. Mr. Dog, please give me back my things." Mr. Dog growled. "Shh, you will never ever get your things back. Now run away, little girl, before I bite you in two." Poor Salma got such a fright when she saw his sharp teeth that she ran and ran and ran until she found her grandfather, dressed in his Anansi costume, telling stories. When Grandfather heard Salma's story, he said, "That's a very exciting story, Salma, but it doesn't sound like a happy ending. How will we save Granny?" "I know," said Salma. "We'll scare Mr. Dog." "Exactly how will we scare Mr. Dog?" asked Grandfather. "Like this," said Salma, putting on the mask of Kaka Matobi, the boogeyman. Salma picked up Anansi's atumpan and beat it loudly. "Goema, goema." Grandfather picked up his rattles and gave them a fierce shake. Shuka, shuka. Little Abu Bakr, who loved a good scare, joined in with the clapping sticks. "Ka-tack, ka-tack." "Let's go," cried Salma. Meanwhile... When Granny saw Mr. Dog flip-flopping up the path, she thought it was her pretty Salma. "Salma, pretty Salma, come give your Granny who loves you a kiss," cried Granny. Mr. Dog leapt up and gave her a sloppy kiss. "Oh my, Salma," said Granny, "what a wet nose you have." Granny took the heavy basket from Mr. Dog and said, "Salma, pretty Salma, you look hungry. Let's eat." Mr. Dog started to chase the speckled rooster round and round. "Oh my, Salma," said Granny, "what an appetite you have." So I started to notice another big difference in this story, which is that when Salma got into trouble, she kind of noticed the trouble earlier on, right? She noticed that the dog was tricking her, and she went to go get help from her grandfather. In the other versions that we've listened to, the woodcutter helped Little Red Riding Hood, but in this story, she went to go get help from her grandfather, and it was actually Selma who came up with the idea to solve the problem. So I'm going to jot that down. Over here next to Pretty Selma, I'm going to write, gets help from grandfather. Okay, so I just jotted that down on this side because we're yet to kind of see whether or not this is going to actually solve the problem, but I'm hopeful that it will. All right, the other thing that I noticed that was interesting is that in the version we listened to earlier this week, it was Little Red Riding Hood who saw the wolf and said, "What big eyes you have, what big teeth you have." But in this version, it's actually Granny who's saying, "Ooh, what a wet nose you have. Ooh, what a big appetite you have." That seems like a difference too. Let's find out what happens with Mr. Dog and Granny. Then Granny said, "Selma, Pretty Selma, it's time for your bath." Into the bath leapt Mr. Dog. Sorry, there's some glare on the picture. Into the bath leapt Mr. Dog. "Oh my, Selma," said Granny, "what hairy ears you have. Are you sure you're my Pretty Selma?" "Oh, yes, yes, yes," cried Mr. Dog, jumping onto Granny's lap and wagging his tail. Now Granny was really worried. Did her Pretty Selma have a tail? Perhaps this wasn't her Pretty Selma. Well, there was only one way to find out. "Let's sing our favorite song," said Granny, and she started to sing. "Oh, Selma, Pretty Selma, come kiss Granny, your darling old Granny, who loves you so." "Woof, woof, woof," barked Mr. Dog. Then Granny knew she had been tricked. She reached for her broom. "Out, get out!" But Mr. Dog liked being Pretty Selma far too much to leave Granny's house, so instead he growled and snapped at her. Granny was afraid Mr. Dog would bite her in two, so she jumped into her cooking pot. Mr. Dog pushed the lid down. Nice, he thought. Granny soup. Granny cried, "Help! Help! Help!" Just then, the door burst open with a loud "Goema, goema, shuka, shuka, katek, katek." When Mr. Dog saw Kaka Matobi the bogeyman, Anansi, and his gang, he got a terrible fright. That bad dog slipped and tripped over his miserable tail, right out of the house, back to the wild side of town. Selma took off her mask and helped Granny climb out of the pot. Then they all sat down to eat watermelon and sip an ice-cold pink drink through candy-striped straws. The next day, Granny sent Selma to market to buy new clothes. Selma went straight there and back, and she never talked to strangers again. So, at the end, I noticed a really big similarity, which is that in both stories, the character learned not to talk to strangers. I think that lesson is really important, so I'm going to jot it down in this middle section. So, character learned not to talk to strangers. Okay. And then the other big difference that I noticed, though, in terms of the events, is that in the other Red Riding Hood stories that we've been eaten, Red Riding Hood and Granny get eaten at some point. And in Pretty Selma, both Granny and Pretty Selma managed to escape from getting eaten. And I felt like that was a really big difference, so I'm going to jot that down. Red Riding Hood, Granny, and Red got eaten. And over underneath Pretty Selma, I'm going to write Granny and Selma don't get eaten. So that's my Venn diagram comparing the two versions of these stories. Really quickly, before I go, I wanted to let you know that I added 2 videos to our playlist today. One of them is a short folktale about Anansi the spider, if you want to learn more about that trickster character. It's not a fairy tale, it's more of a folktale, but I thought that would be interesting to you. And then I also included a video of what an atumpan sounds like when it's played in real life. See you back here tomorrow.